In this video, I'm going to walk you through how I created this Dwarven Fortress entrance in Anvil level design for Blender. My intention is to give you a rough idea of what using Anvil looks like, and if you're new to Blender, a rough idea of what using Blender looks like. But for more comprehensive information, look at the Anvil documentation. I start by making sure that my default material settings for this file are as I expect. First, I select my ground texture in the texture browser, then I press B to enter box builder mode. I use the square brackets to change the grid size, and then I draw a plane. I stay in object mode because I want to separate the ground from the architecture. I create a vertical plane to start my stairs, then I enter edit mode and extrude the plane using E. I use Shift D to duplicate this step into a staircase. Throughout this video, you're going to see me constantly change grid size using the square brackets and constantly flip between face, edge and vertex selection modes using 1, 2 and 3. So I'm not going to call out every time I do that. With the stairs created, I'm going to select the front of each step holding Shift, and then I'm going to pick a step texture that I have saved. Now in this case everything lines up perfectly, but I could use Shift T to rescale it if it didn't. I'm going to do the same for the top of each step. In this case the texture doesn't have any sort of trim, so I'm not so worried about alignment. To border the stairs, I create a box using Box Builder and then use G to move the edges into the shape that I want. Another thing that I do a lot that I won't call out is selecting a texture in the texture browser just before using Box Builder, so the texture is already applied. Box Builder conforms to surfaces, and if you hold Shift you can start with a line in order to draw boxes at angles. To split up this object, I'm going to use Ctrl R to loop cut. Now in this case, I'm going to turn off grid snapping because the raised box is slightly off grid due to the fact that the surface is angled. To apply a trim, I select a face and pick the texture in the file browser. I resize it using Shift and T, forgetting for a moment that the UV transform tool does respect Blender's grid snapping mode. I tile it to the adjacent face using Alt left click. For the raised box, I apply the texture, then use T to snap the rotation, before continuing as I did before with Shift T. I do this just to save me a very small amount of time in manually dragging the rotation how I would like. When I create this next box, I notice the texture scale is off due to my previous work, so I change it manually in the side panel. For this ramp, I extrude a box and then move one edge down. I then press space and use merge by distance to merge co-located vertices. I don't generally worry about quote-unquote good geometry, but I can't stand hidden faces, which is why I do this merge. More Alt left clicking. There's a lot of that when you use Anvil. I extrude a plane, and then this box is just for my reference. Here I extrude and then use S to adjust the scale of the extruded face to create a sort of tapered pillar. I want the same trim on my pillar, so again I loop cut using Ctrl R and then Alt click to tile the trim. When I move things using G, I often hold down the middle mouse button, which locks movement to one axis. More details using Box Builder. You might sometimes notice that I select a lot of faces at once. Typically I'm using L, which selects all connected faces underneath the cursor. As could be expected, holding Shift adds faces to this selection. When objects are moved, Anvil will handle continuous tiling. In the case of trims like this though, that's not necessarily desirable. So you can lock the UV map to keep everything static. I do that here when I use Shift D to duplicate this whole pillar structure. Now I start work on an interior. In this particular case, I'm deciding to have one big shared floor, although this isn't always ideal. I use Box Builder to create my first room. In the bottom left, I turn off the option to keep overlap faces, so the face that's touching the floor won't exist. Then I use W to weld the box, inverting it. I press C to use Cube Cut to cut a square hole in the back wall. I subdivide the top edge and raise the vertex to create a point. It's not strictly necessary, but I connect vertices through this face using Ctrl J. I Alt left click to select the edge loop, then extrude and scale inwards to create a border. Incremental snapping, which is the default in Anvil, means that when you move an object, it will move relatively by the grid size. This doesn't work in this particular case. So I use Ctrl G to toggle to grid snapping, so moving these vertices puts them exactly on the grid. It's kind of difficult to see the grid here, and that's because of a bug in this version of Blender that means when you zoom in far, the grid disappears. I have a PR open for that, so hopefully it will be fixed in future versions of Blender. I duplicate this border twice, and on the second time I flip normals, giving me two end caps of a little tunnel. I Alt, Shift and left click to add edge loops to my selection, then bridge edge loops, creating the tunnel. This internal border was something like a scaffold, so I don't need it anymore. I duplicate the frame and flip the normals there as well, giving me a sort of modular entrance. When I use Box Builder to create another corridor of the same width, the option to skip overlapped faces means that this entrance fits perfectly straight away. I duplicate this entrance once to connect to the outside world, and a second time to connect to an adjoining room. Rotation with grid snapping mode activated is very janky, so I need to change back to incremental snapping mode before the rotation works. In order to demonstrate a way of using CubeCut in a second, I'm going to leave overlapping faces in this room. This means the floor of this room and the floor that I created earlier are Z fighting. So I'm going to hide the existing floor using H. I'm going to delete the new floor, and then I'm going to unhide using Alt H. Now I can show you that CubeCut works in orthographic mode. In this mode, the cut is infinite, so you need to select faces in order to avoid unintended cuts. Here I decide to add some alcoves to the main corridor in order to add some detail. It showcases that when you do a cube cut that cuts through only one face, a weld will create an alcove to the depth of the cut. Just like for Box Builder, you weld by pressing W. I use the hide and delete technique here again to make sure I don't have any Z fighting. I didn't have an appropriate texture saved for this walkthrough, so you can see me browsing for one here. I then add it to the collection that I'd set up earlier. After I've finished adjusting the geometry, I use T to snap the edge of the texture to the edge of the face. To make a more impressive entrance, I start by deleting unnecessary elements of the existing entrance. This is important so that when I extrude in a second, the correct normal is applied. I Alt left click to select edge loops and then do a series of extrudes and scales. I select the new geometry and some reference geometry, then hide everything else using Shift H. To quickly fix all of these vertices, I make sure I'm in grid snapping mode, which again you can consider absolute snapping. I press G to move and then Z to lock the axis. I do the same at the top, although I'm a bit less worried about exact positioning because the player would never see this edge. I then move these faces to create some depth. I unhide using Alt H. I think it looks pretty cool. To start with the terrain, I press Tab to enter object mode, select the terrain, and press Tab again to enter edit mode. I subdivide the initial face to create more geometry to work with, extrude the edges, and then connect them using F. I go to the modifiers menu on the right and add a subdivision modifier. This smooths out the terrain. I apply it so I can then manually edit it. I hide the architecture using the eye icon on the right because it will block sculpting, and then enter sculpting mode. In this mode you can naturally sculpt terrain by clicking and dragging using different brushes. I work on the area around the architecture first so I can unhide it as soon as possible. I don't have anything interesting to say about sculpting, so I'm going to speed up the video until I finish. I select all the appropriate faces, then apply a rocky texture. I Alt left click to select an edge loop, Then I press G twice to do an edge slide. I resize these faces to get the size that I want based on how large I think the transition should be. With all faces selected, I apply a transition texture and press T, then Q to stretch the texture across the height of the transition. After faffing around for a while, I note the scale and rotation of the transition texture and apply that to the other terrain faces. I want to add prefabs, so in a new Blender file, I set the Anvil prefab mode to library. I import a couple of tree models I found on itch, link in the description, and make a rock, which I'll fast forward for this video. To tell Anvil these are prefabs, I can right-click in the hierarchy and choose Mark as Asset, or click Make All Free Objects Assets. With that saved, I return to the main file and add it as a library. When I press Shift 3, I can see my prefabs. I enable random size and random rotation to give some variation when I add these prefabs. I choose a prefab in the prefab browser to add it to the scene. After adding a prefab, pressing W to weld will add it again. With skybox and lighting, the scene looks like this. To learn more about Anvil, watch the quick start video on this YouTube channel, read the documentation, or come chat to me in Discord. Support me on Patreon, all of the links in the description and the pinned comment.